My name is Edward Town. I'm the Assistant Curator of Paintings and Sculpture here at the Yale Centre for British Art. I'm delighted to be here with two esteemed colleagues, Professor Catherine Roach from the Virginia Commonwealth University and Dr. Jessie Park, Nina and Lee Griggs, Assistant Curator of European Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. We're going to be talking about an individual who had several names, and some of those names were self-generated and some imposed upon him. These are complex biographies, and sometimes they're going to be difficult to follow. To add to the complexity, I know Dr. Park as Jessie, as she knows me as Ed, or rather than Dr. Town or Edward. Ditto, Professor Roach goes by both Catherine and Kate. As museum-affiliated people, we aim for consistency, but you're going to forgive us if there's any slippage over the course of the next hour. Likewise, we're going to refer to the sitter in this portrait as Mai or Omai, but in modern Tahiti, the name is pronounced Mai. So the next time we have this conversation, we might be saying Mai. The premise for this conversation, which is going to be focused around this portrait, is a generous loan of this painting, newly conserved by the Yale University Art Gallery, from the Art Gallery to the Yale Centre for British Art. So this picture has travelled the mighty distance across Chapel Street, where it's currently on display upstairs on the 4th floor. I'd encourage anyone who has the time, just after this talk, to join my colleague Pilar Forrest, who will be on hand to escort the group up to the 4th floor and continue the conversation. Here it is. You can see in this slide that the painting has been included within a selection of studies and preparatory works made by artists in the mid to late 18th century. Here's the picture. Ahead of the installation, a new label was crafted, and with that came the opportunity to revisit the title of the painting, which we're going to be discussing today. But can I kick off the conversation by asking, who is the painting? Sorry, pardon me. Who is the person depicted in this picture? What were his names? And what does each name tell us about his lived experience?
Thank you, Ed or Edward. I'm glad we're acknowledging that the multiplicity of names is actually a widespread cultural practice, including in our own. And so you're looking on the screen at a portrait of a historic individual who bore many names over the course of his lifetime and the course of his extraordinary journeys. He is famous now as the first Polynesian person to visit Britain, and he did so as part of the voyages of Captain Cook, the explorer and imperialist. And his biography before his first encounter with British travelers was that he was someone who was born to the middling rank of society in what were called at the time, the European term was the Society Islands, but part of the vast chain of Polynesian islands close to, but not on Tahiti. And he was born in a place called Raiatea. And when he was a sort of a teenager, his family was dispossessed because his island was invaded by neighboring islanders from Bora Bora. And so he's someone who is within his own society, has lost property, has lost rank, has lost his homeland. And so when the British ships arrive, he takes a chance. And one thing to know about him is he is an adventurer. And he is someone who reinvents himself many times over the course of his journeys. And the British allow him to join the ship, first as what they called a supernumerary, so kind of an extra person aboard the ship. And then eventually, over the course of the voyage home, they had lost so many crew, including to a conflict in New Zealand with indigenous peoples of New Zealand, that they were down men. They needed bodies to run the ship. And so we know that this person, who we now call Mai most of the time, was enlisted as a sailor and actually worked his passage to London before arriving and then transforming into his best known role, which was as an exotic visitor and a celebrity, and someone who was both a sort of darling of society and someone who was objectified and treated as a kind of scientific specimen simultaneously.
And that's the context for the production of this sketch. which relates to the full-length portrait now co-owned by the National Portrait Gallery London and the Getty Institute in California. Jessie, can I ask, what is the Yale University Art Gallery painting? What purpose did it serve?
Yes, so for this painting that the Yale Art Gallery owns is a preparatory sketch that was made in anticipation of the full-length portrait that you see on the left side of this slide. And it's a way for Joshua Reynolds to really think about how to delineate and portray this visitor from Raiatea with the physiognomy that's different from the visitors that he is more accustomed to portraying in his many portraits. And also thinking about his hair, his body comportment, and eventually the dress. What is he going to actually wear for the full-length portrait? So Reynolds is really kind of thinking through this process of understanding and transforming this figure in anticipation for the full-length portrait, which is the version that you're seeing on the right side. And there is something quite interesting about the portrait itself too, because as you can see in the photograph, the condition has been heavily abraded. There's a lot of compromise in the ways in which he's portrayed here. And that's as a result of a major mid-20th century intervention that took place in the 1950s and 60s, which on the occasion of the loan to the Yale Center for British Art here this year, that as a curator of European art at the gallery, I thought it was a really incredible imperative for us to really think about how to undo these mid-20th century intervention to actually get as close as possible to the original configuration of the oil sketch. So that's the current state that you see as a result of many months of my dear colleague, Sydney Schwartz, who has worked extensively on restoring this painting to appear the way it does now.
Can you tell us a little bit about when it came to Yale?
Yes, so this painting arrived at Yale in 1936. But to give a little bit more kind of context behind how it arrived at Yale, just like actually the full-length portrait, this sketch was in Joshua Reynolds' studio until his death in 1796. And there was a major sale of works that were in Joshua Reynolds' studio 4 years later. And so in that sale, this painting, this oil sketch becomes part of that sale. And it gets sold to then mayor of London, Richard Clarke. And Richard Clarke owns it for about 13 years or so. And then it goes back on the market and it gets purchased by a lawyer and a collector named John William Sears in the beginning of the 19th century. And it was actually when the painting was in the collection of Sears that it was lent to the British Institution for the major Joshua Reynolds retrospective that took place in 1813, which is actually a topic of a book project that Kate is working on. And so from that point on, it passes several different hands. And so I'm just gonna fast forward about 100 years from that point. So now we're kind of getting into the early 20th century. It gets into the possession of a British historian named Evan Edward Charteris. And from there, it gets back on the market, gets sold by another British writer whose name is Randall Davies. And Davies sells a painting to a major dealer in London named P.D. Colnaghi. And that sale takes place in 1934. And 2 years later, the Yale Art Gallery purchased a painting from Colnaghi in 1936. So it's really kind of interesting to think about how up until the very first couple centuries into 20th century, the painting remained pretty much in London the whole time. And also there's another kind of a backstory to this. Yale did not simply purchase the painting out of vacuum. There's a bit of precedent to this. So back in 1932, before Konagi approached us about the painting, there was an interest within the Yale circle. So the person who famously goes by Lefty Lewis, who is Wilmarth Sheldon Lewis, who is kind of the founder of the Lewis Walpole collection here in Farmington. He saw this another version of the full-length portrait, which is now believed to have been painted by Reynolds's major pupil, James Northcote, and he thought at the time was that the version that he saw, the full-length portrait version that he saw by Northcote, was the original by Reynolds. And so Lefty Lewis wanted to acquire it. He talks to sorry, I'm blanking on the name here, Chauncey Brewster Tinker, who is the professor of English literature here on campus. And Brewster also sees it, Brewster Tinker also sees it in London in 1932 and realizes he absolutely wanted to acquire this painting for Yale. So there's a lot of back and forth between these two men. And eventually Tinker approaches Theodore Sizer, or Tubby Sizer, the director of the Yale Art Gallery back then. Hey, can you please purchase this painting? And Sizer was very ambivalent about purchasing it. He wasn't quite sure about the quality likewise. It's unclear exactly how his sentiment around that Northcote version was like, based on just strictly archival materials. So there was a lot of persuasion from Tinker on Sizer for the next couple, like a year and a half or so. And then basically the ball gets dropped in 1934. And then 2 years later, we have this opportunity to acquire the sketch version, actually by Reynolds. So it's really kind of interesting that there is already a kind of precedent for acquiring something by Reynolds of Omai or Mai.
And I think perhaps at this point, it would be a good time to mention the Reynolds full length, its history. Some of you might have seen recently, there was a very well-publicized sale in which the full length was purchased for £50 million, which is a record for a Reynolds canvas. And indeed, it was such a push for a public institution to acquire the work that ownership is now shared between the National Portrait Gallery London and the Getty in Los Angeles. So this quintessential painting of the traveler will now be shared between those institutions, which means it will always be traveling. Sometimes to London, sometimes to Los Angeles. It's due to come to Los Angeles in a couple of years. But the relationship between the Yale canvas and what's now the jointly owned full length is that we believe the Yale canvas was the study. So late in his stay in London, Mai came to Reynolds' studio. It was not a commission, interestingly. So this is something that the artist was doing on speculation. We think to capitalize on the celebrity of Mai. But the sort of one of the questions that's raised for us when we think about who is depicted in the picture is that this person actually had so many names throughout history that any one will not do. And so you see here on the screen, we sort of walk through, you can think of his biography as a series of names. And there are many different available options. We now say Mai, but in the 18th century, when he was moving around London, he was known as Omai. And Jessie, do you want to share why that was?
Yeah, so there is a lot of misunderstanding about Polynesian language at this point, especially the Tahitian language. And I qualify that Tahitian because there's so much diversity around languages throughout the greater Polynesian region. And also, I also have to point out that the word Polynesia is a Western term imposed upon that whole region in the Pacific. It was coined by a French scholar in the 1760s. And so it kind of became the term for describing that part of the globe. And by this point, in the mid-18th century, there was very little understanding of the Tahitian language within the Europeans, by the Europeans. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding of what the sound should sound the way it does. And from the Europeans' perspective, the fact that also Tahitian language, the idea of Tahitian language is quite drastically different from the Europeans in the sense that there was only an oral tradition. There was no written tradition in this particular region here. So just trying to kind of think about how to transcribe an oral tradition, knowledge, information, and histories and belief from an oral-based tradition into a written tradition, that in and of itself is a challenge, and which results in a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication, and it's even I would say mistranscribing of the sounds that they're hearing for the very first time or very unfamiliar with it. And for the Tahitian language, there is oftentimes the use of the particle, the word, what we call the sound of O, which is understood as a particle of speech that precedes a nominative noun. So we could understand it as it is or also the. And there was also a very common practice to put the letter O in the English spelling before the actual name comes. So Tahiti was not Tahiti, it's Otaheite. So there's also the O that precedes the name. So Omai in this case too, that's where the precedent comes from, the addition of the O.
And we know that this was the name he used socially in London, and I love this piece of ephemera. This is a calling card that Mai would have used while moving around London. In this case, he's calling on Miss Banks, who is the sister of Joseph Banks, the naturalist with whom he lived for a time. I think it's fascinating that someone, and we don't know whom, was it Mai, was it someone else, has chosen this chinoiserie motif, right? This motif that sort of evokes European ideas of the East, but a very different region and nation of the East. And also this beautiful copper plate script. We don't know if this is his hand or if someone has written out the calling card for him. We do know that he was very interested in pursuing power alliances with the British. He hoped to secure basically a military alliance to retake his lost homeland, and also was interested in acquiring skills to navigate English society, including lessons in writing. So we don't know if this is his handwriting or not, but it does tell us that as he moved through the world, oh my is what he used. But now we have this question of, do we use something that is authentic to his experience in London and how he became truly famous, including plays named after him? Or do we use the term that is more correct to the language of his home nation?
And there's a curious detail at the bottom right of this calling card is the date. And it's an auspicious date for us because it's the date in which the full-length portrait by Reynolds is exhibited at the Royal Academy, where Reynolds is president. I think speaking of calling cards, it's interesting that Reynolds does not sell this picture, as mentioned earlier. It's not a commission. It's only after Reynolds' death that it enters an aristocratic collection. Ditto the study as well. Was never intended to be exhibited. So what we're doing in the gallery here is an artificial act. The actual piece of old 18th century canvas is only the oval. It's been lined onto a lining canvas and then put into a neoclassical frame from the 20th century. But just to spell it out, it's not a painting that was intended to be exhibited. But obviously that's something that we're doing. And in that process, the museum, UAG, crafts what we call tombstone information. So that's the very basic information about the artist, the sitter, and the materials, and alongside a label as well. So Jessie, you've spoken about the journey of this picture. It's changed hands several times. Its appearance has also changed a great deal over the last centuries. Can you say a little bit about the most recent conservation treatment?
Yes, absolutely. So with regards to the mid-20th century intervention I mentioned a little bit earlier, The mid-20th century version intervention has taken place as a result of wanting to kind of get to the very bottom of the original paint work by Reynolds. And that was the kind of spirit of conservation practice at the time. And so whatever a conservator finds it to be not original, they will strip them down all the way. And so unfortunately, as a result of that, sometimes the original paint actually does get lost. And at the Yale Art Gallery, we commissioned a Massachusetts-based conservator named Warren Bradley to work on the restoration of this painting. And he was actually working pretty much unsupervised, without any kind of a curator or a specialist at Reynolds Paintings to really guide him through his treatment. And so from Warren Bradley's practice and the spirit of conservation philosophy at the time, he stripped down everything that he thought was not by Reynolds. And he started basically filling in for the the areas that he thought was lost. And because this is not a quote unquote finished work where every part of it is fully worked out, and because it's an oil sketch, it's meant to be a preparatory. It's a way to really explore the sitter that Reynolds was looking at. That there are these parts of the painting that Warren Bradley wasn't quite sure what to do with because it wasn't fully delineated. And so he did what he could, and it unfortunately just became a botched treatment. And it returned to us in an absolutely horrendous condition. So the painting came to us in a heavily abraded state with a lot of paint flaking. And some of the contours of the figure's face, for example, was so bizarre that it was just physiognomically impossible situation. There was a kind of very ambiguous delineation of the contour of his forehead, and just above his left eye. And there are several very, very visible brushstrokes by Reynolds that were completely obliterated. And so when the Yale Center for British Art asked us to lend this painting recently, I thought it was the perfect occasion to have one of our most talented conservators on site, Cindy Schwartz, who's no longer with us. I asked Cindy to actually work on this treatment to really undo the mid-20th century intervention. And let's really try to understand and think thoughtfully about how the painting could be represented for not simply greater political legibility, but also to really understand that we are not going to get to the bottom of exactly how the original should have looked like. So to be able to really acknowledge that acknowledge that literally in a physical manifestation, we worked on removing the varnish and reversing all of the mid-20th century intervention. And based on a photograph of the painting upon its acquisition in the 1930s, and the photograph of the full-length version at the MPG, currently at the MPG, that we looked as a reference point to really understand and try to really restore what the original painting, the painting in its original state could have looked like. So this is what this is a result of that process. And so some of the brushstrokes have been restored. The existing, these are amazing work. A lot of the abraded parts of the painting also have been consolidated so that we could see the figure much more clearly. And also a lot of the kind of the unstable components of the painting also have been fully stabilized. So, so this is the current state that you're seeing. So this is a way for us to, again, present to our visitors very clearly that this is another, this is another intervention to the original work of art. And this is part of curatorial practice. Curatorial practice is not simply presenting something as a fact per se. There's many different aspects of emphasizing certain things and de-emphasizing other things. And the conservation practice is just one part of that practice, or basically an echo of that practice, if you see it from that standpoint.
And with the legibility improved, how might we read this complicated object? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, I love that question, Edward. And I think for me, I think the kind of the position that Cindy and I really came from when we were approaching this project was that I'm not a Polynesian, I'm not a Tahitian. And neither is Cindy. So we were both assuming our positionality when we were approaching this painting. And so when we are looking at this painting, what we can do best is to really think first and foremost what Reynolds was trying to achieve. And how can you really understand Reynolds' paintings practice per se? So that's where really our first point of intervention really stood. And then from that point, we were trying to kind of think about the ways in which we should be reading this painting, which is that this is the function of it is a sketch. So let's really kind of highlight the fact that this is a preparatory work for the full length, meaning that it's totally okay where there's many areas in which the passages are unresolved, visually unresolved. And so what we are seeing here is that allows us to really think about who really has the authority and the voice in really understanding and reading this image. For me as a curator thinking about this project too, is that's the kind of the imperative of the curatorial practice, that the rights to conserve represent a figure through the lens of Joshua Reynolds, and also through the lens of a 21st century curator. There's just a lot of different modes of engagement with the sitter, with the ways in which we see Reynolds now, that should be informing the ways in which we understand this work of art. So it's a long way of saying that there is definitely acknowledgement of the fact that this is a Europeanized convention of Mai's image. And that in the way, the sort of the three-quarters view, his gaze that doesn't look straight at us, the sort of the avoidance of his gaze upon the viewer, and also the fact that there is this understanding of really trying to differentiate him from the European physiognomy too. The ways in which his lips are rendered, as also the nose, it's quite prominent, as well as his curly hair. That appears that from Reynolds' standpoint looks different from the Europeans. And so there are these kind of components of wanting to kind of other the sitter, but at the same time conform him according to the conventions of the European aesthetic. They're both of those modes are happening at the same time in this picture.
And when brought into the canon of Western art, I think this picture poses some real sort of challenges, particularly in its quote unquote unfinished state. Lots of the brushwork is gestural, it's quick, so it gives this sketch a vivacity and an immediacy, because this is a life sitting, unlike the full-length portrait. But there are certain passages which are quite ambiguous. So the left proper shoulder, for example, there's this sort of passage of white that could be misconstrued as something like a falling ruff. That's not necessarily what the artist is striving for. So the object needs a lot of careful thought. Before we move on to the other picture, I just wondered, Kate, whether or not you have anything further to add at this point.
Well, I'm maybe building off what Jessie said about in the conservation treatment, wanting to embrace uncertainty, to understand that we are not going to see what it would look like fresh on the easel in Reynolds' canvas. There's been too much change over time. We have the same debate in what to call the person and what to call the picture. We want to sort of create space, as scholars, for multiplicity, for the fact that some of my students call me Professor Roach. Some of them call me Professor Kate, which I very much enjoy. And similarly, he was wearing all of these different names. And so, we mentioned Omai and Mai. There's also, when he was on ship, apparently he mostly went by Jack, which is a very working class English name associated with Jack Tar, which is the stereotypical trope of the sailor, kind of the jolly sailor is a Jack Tar. When he was actually rolled on shipboard, his name was Tootby Homey, And we don't know if Homie is like Omi is like Omai. You know, the person who was taking the record wrote down Omi. You know, is that related? And then later, someone said that his name from his nation was actually Paradero and not Omai at all. And Omai was something he had invented because it was basically a fancy name. And so when he arrives in London, the theory is he might have given himself a social promotion, step up in the world, leaving behind a common name, taking a more elite name. And so our quandary is we have this rich historical material. We know that he was changing names the way he was changing clothing and taking on a different persona each time he did. And so what do we call him? Currently, we often say my because it seems the most culturally respectful, and then in parentheses, oh my, which I love because then you're saying my oh my. And it's an exclamation. And I actually think there's something, the reason the O is there is it's a cultural misunderstanding. But Richard White, the scholar, has shown us that in encounters with Europeans and indigenous nations, oftentimes there are productive misunderstandings. The two agents of two different cultures they're in the same interaction. They don't understand what the other person is going for. And yet that can create productive meetings and productive misunderstandings. And so I think oh my is actually a happy accident because it is an exclamation and it is so redolent. Then you add the potential biblical. If he's called Omiah, it has this potential biblical resonance to it. And so we've been thinking a lot about embracing multiplicity, but then as curators, there's a different imperative in terms of museum practice. So I wonder if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I could just quickly add to what Kate just mentioned about like one of these many names associated with this particular figure, once he actually returns to Polynesia, he gets dropped off without his desire at the island of Huahina, where he was actually taking refuge before he takes off to go to the British Isles. And so when he arrives at returns to Huahina, he gets the name by the local chief, the name Pari, which means wise or instructed. So there is another kind of, name associated with him. So it's so fascinating to kind of really understand how much of these names is he really holding on to that associates with his many different forms of identity, or whether that he sees himself in these very complex figure, the way we associate his names with his identity. And also the idea, the fact, the historical reality of the locals actually giving him a different name upon his return gets us to the question of who actually has a say in calling this man. And I think for curators, and then Edward could talk about this too further, where we try to kind of think about how to call this work of art that represents the figure. At least in the Yale Art Gallery standpoint, our current state is that we have this naming convention for titles of Title IV works that are in preparation for the finished version. And that configuration is typically study 4. And so that kind of that basically became our standard practice of calling this painting to study 4 blank, which is the title called the Portrait of Mai or Omai. And that title of Portrait of Mai or Omai, that comes from the Getty, the way Getty actually titles their painting. And so we're taking on what this other institution that owns, I would say 50% of the painting. We're basically privileging that as a basis for titling this work in our collection, and in that sense, I think it's strictly in terms of taxonomical purposes, meaning how we categorize these works. It makes sense, but does that actually do justice to the figure himself? That's where it gets really, really challenging here. And I wonder if there's a better way or alternative way to really explore and capture all of his different names associated with him that really, really centers on the figure and less so on the functionality of the work itself. So I'm very curious to hear what Edward has to say about this too.
Well, to address the question, I'm going to bring in another example, this time from the Yale Centre for British Arts collection. And it's another painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds, whereas this picture was exhibited, the Portrait of Mai, exhibited in 1776. The picture on the right was exhibited in 1782, so some 6 years later. And the title it carried when it was exhibited was Portrait of a Nobleman. And that conforms to the norms of titling in the exhibition catalogues at the time, where the sitters' names are anonymized. This painting, which hangs in the library court of the museum, carries two inscriptions on it as well, likely added within decades of the painting being made. You probably can't see them here, but bottom left, the sitter, there is an inscription that gives the sitter's name as the Earl of Harrington, and the bottom right, the attribution is given to Joshua Reynolds. In other words, no mention is made of the young man who accompanies the Earl of Harrington in this portrait. And you can see in the slide here that that process of anonymizing and negating to mention the sitter's name was carried forward in time, and for several years at this institution, the painting simply went by the title Charles Stanhope, 3rd Earl of Harrington. That was until 2022, when the identity of this young man was recovered through some fantastic sleuthing work by my colleague Victoria Hepburn, then working in the Paintings and Sculpture department. The department had been contacted by an archivist working in the West Sussex Record Office who made a really astute observation. Alice Muller there had noticed that on the same day that one of the Earl of Harrington's children was baptized at the parish of St. Martin in the Fields. So you people will be familiar with that parish. It's the parish that overlooks Trafalgar Square, next to the National Gallery in London. The same day that one of the children of the Earl was baptized, there was a young man called Marcus Richard Fitzroy Thomas of Jamaica, aged around 19. Alice Millard, the archivist, made the observation that not only were these the only two individuals baptized on that day, but Marcus Richard Fitzroy Thomas shared many of the names associated with this aristocratic family. So this was a really sort of interesting idea that was only proved when my colleague Victoria Hepburn traveled to the Royal Academy and requested to see Sir Joshua Reynolds' daybook, or pocket book, in which he recorded the sittings, the people who came to sit for their portraits in his studio. And she found a name that had been completely overlooked by previous scholarship. So the day after Lord Harrington sat to have his portrait made, Marcus came as well. And that was that gave us the sufficient amount of information to to say with confidence that this was indeed the young man depicted in the painting. And from there, with such an unusual name, it was quite easy to follow Marcus's biography in the paper record. But what became obvious was that over the course of Marcus Thomas's life, his name was recorded in many different ways. And we can just, this is a slide that maps out everything that's known really from his biography. But what becomes apparent is that his name was amorphous, and over the course of his life, it gets increasingly long, and it really only appears in the same form on one occasion. And by the time of his death, it's recorded as Marquis Richard Henry Fitzroy Frederick Augustus Thomas. So by this point, he's left the household of the Earl of Harrington. He's started a family, he's married, and he's served for many years as a drummer in the Westminster Militia. He's been living in Soho in London. And it seems as if he's sort of expanding and working perhaps in a creative way with these names that had been the sort of preserve of the aristocratic family who had likely brought him from Jamaica in 1780 and in whose household he'd served. So this name and this amorphous identity does sort of pose straightforward problems for a museum. Which name should we record? What should appear in the label, in the metadata, in the information that we disseminate around the world? Yeah, what was this young man's name? And I wonder, yeah, Jessie, whether or not that inflects interesting ways upon my story. And there are important differences here. Mai chose to travel, whereas Marcus Thomas did not. Marcus was likely born into chattel slavery in Jamaica and was brought by the Earl of Harrington to Britain. But Mai's biography is a different one. And I wondered if we could just dwell in the couple of minutes we have left before we open up for questions, thinking about some of the other actors in Mai's life and his time in Britain.
Oh, absolutely. So you see here, this is a group, we'll call it a group portrait to start, conversation piece perhaps. And you see Mai standing clothed very similarly to the Reynolds full-length portrait. In the center is Joseph Banks, the naturalist. And then seated is his fellow scientist, man named Solander. And as you can see, the register of this is, it is a group of men in a study, but it's also two British or European scientists examining a living specimen. And I think there's a real tension in this image between the idea of the humanity of Mai as someone whom they lived and socialized. They went to horse races together, they went to fox hunting matches together. But also, particularly the way that Banks is gesturing towards Mai's hand, we now know that what he's gesturing towards are the tattoos that Mai had, that immediately registered that he's from a different cultural sphere with a different set of cultural practices around bodily adornment and particularly painting the body. And of course, 18th century Britons were constantly painting their bodies, but more often with temporary makeup. And actually, tattoos are more closely associated with sailors because it was the people who traveled who first engaged in that practice. But there's a real tension here, and how is he being treated socially? And this is no longer Jack. That much we know, right? This is Omai and his role that I would argue he invented. He invented the role of Omai, a Polynesian traveler, and performed it quite successfully. And Banks and Solander are kind of, you can think of them as collaborators in this creation in various ways. And people who are also, I think it's important to point out, benefiting professionally and socially from this association. Banks has had a quarrel with some of the authorities who run the Navy, the Admiralty, and being the official host for Omai actually puts him back in the good graces of the Earl of Sandwich. And so there's a real mutual self-interest in sort of building this idea of the person who is a celebrity, but also really, I think we have to acknowledge, being treated as an exotic specimen as well.
And whose image is also being disseminated through print as well. We're just going to cycle through a series of images, but maybe you could just say a couple of words about these two engravings very quickly.
Yes, we were talking earlier today that if you took the captions off of many of the circulating images of Mai, you wouldn't necessarily think these were images of the same person from the same nation. But various artists were capitalizing, as Reynolds was seeking to do, on the enormous celebrity of this figure. And it's fascinating. One thing we were talking about earlier today is that we know that when he was in London and in England, Omai, most days was probably in an English gentleman's suit. And we have his bills from his hairdresser and his tailor and his shoemaker. But when he is represented visually, it's always in this kind of exoticizing costume. And so there's a way in which his social self and his sort of performance of authenticity as a Polynesian visitor are divorced in interesting ways. And he's code switching. And so I think we can think of the names in a similar way, that one day he's wearing this kind of outfit we see In the engravings, another day he's wearing his very nice velvet suit that he wore to court. And in the same way, you know, that he's Mai, he's May, he's Omai, he's Paradero, he's Jack, depending on the occasion.
I think that might be a really nice moment to bring the conversation between us to an end. And I'll end with this final slide here with another title, well, an alternative title for this object, to pose the question, what should we call this man? And here the illustration that I've used is a proof stage for one of the engravings, but I think it speaks to this sort of disembodied experience of this remarkable man and his remarkable life. Thank you. We have questions, yeah.
Thanks for the very helpful discussion, and also for getting into the question of metadata. This is the naming aspect is something we deal with libraries, and we're doing some retrospective looking at names of authors, especially Mrs. His name, right? A woman who only goes by the husband's name, and reclaiming it. And we've made a lot of progress. However, what happens, or something we need to contend with, is that if we decide to then change a name or upgrade it, and nobody else does, then our materials won't be found if somebody's searching for it, right? So because the historical record, for better or worse, has Omai and Mai as sort of the main appellative for this person, our best intentions can be fulfilled now, but they also might put us out of sync with research, because now we actually create another or a alternate view. So how do you reconcile a intent to find a name that seems to be the best one with the historic record?
Yeah, and what you see on the screen is the kitchen sink solution, right? We've just put it all in there, and it has the virtue of being extremely rich and extremely accurate, but it's also very clunky. And there is, you know, in museum cataloging, there is an impulse into clarity, brevity, and then also, as you point out, location, right? The searchability, right? It has to be something that will speak to researchers trying to find these images.
Yep, absolutely. I think it really kind of gets to the core of discoverability, and how do we discover a person? And I think in this particular day and age where we could just type anything on the search bar to find something, that anything can be recorded in writing with using very specific terms. So there's this sense of something has to be absolute rather than fluid. And I think that approach really complicates, I think it could potentially become a barrier to really fully understanding this incredible complexity around figures like Mai, or many other figures like him, whose names who bears many names, or there are figures who whose names are pronunciation-wise very similar, but their spelling has changed multiple times. So how do we kind of really capture all of that data in order for us to really discover that figure? Is a difficult question. And I think for us as curators, there may not be the perfect or ideal solution to it, but the fact that we can acknowledge that we have limitations in our curatorial practice to really make these figures, the historical realities known, and be very transparent about it. I think that's a very important first step to take.
It's interesting though to think about like the threshold for a museum. Like, what is a title that's too long? Is it Dort, Dortrek, the packet boat, you know, the Kant or whatever, or is this just that? Is that too long? It's hard to say. John, there's another question.
Thank you. Thanks for this very informative and really engaging panel. Right in the midst of the creation of these works, the subject was staged. And in a work designed by the leading scenographer of the day, was also a significant easel painter, well represented in the collections here. I wonder if that sheds any light in your view on the what I see as the two parts of the image by Reynolds, the sketch, which seems to me, and this may just be a projection, more inward, and the public figure who, even though the physiognomy is similar, very almost identical, and the position of the head is almost identical, it may be the costume that gives him the publicness, the command. He seems to be in charge of the space. And I wonder if the fact that Reynolds, who went to Drury Lane all the time with his ear trumpet, so as not to miss a word, might have picked up some ideas there, or whether the production itself was part of this world. I can't remember the exact dates, so you would probably know.
So the play Omai of that title is actually staged, I think, a few years after he leaves. But while Omai is in London, he is a great fan of the theater. And in fact, when they're off on a kind of jaunt with Banks and Sandwich touring, Sandwich is doing his job and touring the dockyards. And so they end up in Plymouth together as a kind of holiday. So it's like a business holiday trip, and Omai is there with Banks. And Banks records in letters that they went to the Playhouse several times he says, Omai bespoke the play. So it's Mai who wants to go and see this performance, and he's very interested in that. So I'm also, I'm thinking about how is Reynolds inspired by theatrical stagings, and also how is Omai himself thinking about encountering a new mode of performance when he's obviously in a role which is, every day socially he's performing, as we see in that group portrait, the conversation piece, the role of the exotic visitor, which I think he's really inventing for himself.
And also, and I thank you for that great question. I think I wonder too, adding to what Kate just said, how much of the performance is incorporated into the ways of survival for the case of Mai or Omai. He is in a context that's so removed from his originating culture and the region, the customs, and he's expected to be a certain figure, expected to be a specimen from afar. And that pressure, must have put him so much pressure to perform or act in a way that conforms to those expectations. And if he doesn't, what are the consequences? So I wonder if it's also equally important for us to think about how much of his survival mode really comes into play when it comes to his performance in the British context. And I also love the fact that you mentioned about how the Yale sketch, in the Yale sketch, he looks more inward. I love it because when the painting was acquired in the 1930s, the black and white photograph of it doesn't show him as an inward-looking person. His pupils are wider, his eyelids are also rounder. And so there was definitely sort of the transformation of the way he looks now because of the mid-20th century intervention that took place.
Thank you so much for this. You talked about how Mai was a celebrity in the 1770s. I'm struck that these paintings, or at least one of them, had an afterlife. And I was wondering if you could talk about, the reception, the British institution exhibitions, how are people thinking about this a generation later, once he's out of sight, out of mind, and the painting is just kind of is itself?
Well, thank you. So the Yale sketch was shown at the British Institution, which was an art philanthropic exhibition society, at a really important landmark exhibition, which was the first retrospective. So after Reynolds passed, He'd been gone for about 20 years, and the decision was made to do something that hadn't ever been done before on that scale, which was to gather together as many Reynolds paintings in one place as possible. So it was a survey of his artistic production. This picture was there. And there are several representations of people of color from Reynolds's career that were shown there. This is the only person of color in that exhibition who has a name in the title. Everyone else is referred to by their national origin or their racialized type. And so it's interesting that Omai gets the dignity of a proper name, and that he's exceptional in that way. So his celebrity has carried through to the early 19th century.
And also for the full-length portrait, when it was after, well, it was in Reynolds' studio, so as the oil sketch until Reynolds' death. And the full-length portrait was exhibited in 1776, and it doesn't get exhibited anywhere until Reynolds dies. It gets passed on to other people's hands, and it finally gets exhibited in the 1813 exhibition. So that's a several decades of gap between the first time it was shown and the next time he gets shown to the wider public. So in the interim, I think that's where the role of the prints can really come in. These many reproductive prints that were done immediately after this one, the full-length version was created, that really allowed the celebrity of Mai to perpetuate and revive over and over again. And it gets a massive circulation, not just within the British context, but also it gets disseminated into other parts of Europe.
And just to clarify, the Yale image was in the 1813 retrospective. The full length was not, probably because at that point it was in Castle Howard, so it was owned by an aristocratic family who weren't going to put it in a cart and send it down to London at that moment.
Last question from Tim.
We've got three curators on stage, and I want you each to tell us what your ideal curatorial setting for this picture would be. Because I've seen it in a Reynolds retrospective, in Art and the British Empire, in an exhibition about celebrity in the 18th century, and then, you know, in an auction house, now in the National Portrait Gallery with portraits of well-known English people. Where would you like to, if you could put it in any context, in a gallery, what would you surround it with?
You talk about the full-length portrait.
The full-length.
Full-length portrait. Love to bring it to the Yale Centre British Art.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Library Court.
Yeah, Library Court, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, let's bring it to Library Court. Yeah.
Super. Jessie.
I would like actually both of these works to be at the art gallery. Because of Yale's long history of interest in the figure, interest in this particular representation of the figure. And we also already have some prints of Mai in our collection as well. So it would be wonderful to bring all of those works together in a single gallery at the art gallery.
Would you put any Polynesian objects with it?
Absolutely.
If you had any?
Do it very thoughtfully, yes.
Yeah. Okay, last but not least, British
This is
institution.
not my suggestion. In other words, I didn't originate this, but there has also been the question of, you know, the fundamental assumption of the joint ownership is that this painting should travel. And so if the full length should travel, there have been suggestions, should it go to Tahiti?
Yep.
Right? Should it go back to the islands where he was born and lived and wanted to go back to and wanted to reclaim his patrimony. And I think we know it can go on a plane. It's going to do that regularly for the rest of its existence. So I think that does make a strong argument, right? If we can put it on a plane, why not send it there? And I'd be really, really interested to know what the curators there would want to do with it, how they want to display it.
Thank you.
So we've been talking for almost precisely an hour. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to our speakers and to encourage you, if you haven't seen the sketch in person, to join my colleague Pilar Forrest, who is at the back of the room with her hand raised, who will lead a group up there and to see the paintings discussed in this afternoon's conversation. But thank you very much for joining us.